morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome back into the Johann Fust Library Foundation Loggia. And for those of you who were with us yesterday afternoon at 4 o'clock, and you did not want that evening to end, the good news is it didn't. We get to hear from George Stevens Jr. today. He will be in conversation with our former board chair, President Lindsay Major. But before I hand the mic over to them, I just want to say a few words about our staff, who are incredible. Bobby and Julianne, if you could, and Deanna, who is not here with us, please stand. We've had an incredible couple weeks of programs, and these back to back, and they just go about it with cheerfulness and everything.
Thank you, Kathy.
So thank you, Bobby and Julianne. And welcome, George and Lindsay. And
Thank you.
Thanks.
I was just telling George, I am in awe of him. I just finished his wonderful book last night, My Place in the Sun. And your accomplishments, all the things that you have done are remarkable. And you're a nice guy, too. So, George, you wrote, produced, and directed the film, which was a remarkable tribute to your father. But I felt, and maybe some others felt, it was also an education for us about the process of making great films. Your father's, and Evidence, the film we saw yesterday, which was just remarkable. Thank you.
Thank you.
So you began with his quote, "Life is a journey, and it's always most interesting when you're not sure where you are going."
That's my father's quote.
Yes, yeah. And did you hear him say that often?
I found it in his wartime diary. He said that he spoke of it on D-Day and all the way through to the liberation of Dachau. And he said that he had a 50-yard line seat, seeing men at their best and at their worst.
Yeah. So that quote kind of set the tone for your film. And you opened the film with that lovely panorama of his artifacts and films and books and all the things that he left for you. And did you find things that really surprised you in that collection?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, well,
all the scripts from the Laurel and Hardy comedies that we all love, that my father was the 24 to 26-year-old cameraman of.
well, in the beginning, it seemed that comedy was his forte, and he was involved in making 25, I think you said, Laurel and Hardy movies.
Mm-hmm.
And then he left Hal Roach because he wanted to make a different kind of comedy with believable characters.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, yeah, but I think I might do is just start at the beginning, because in a way, this is a family story. And I might, as I neglected to yesterday, that I had a wonderful collaborator 40 years ago when I made George Stevens' A Filmmaker's Journey, my daughter Caroline. And Caroline is here. And it's related because we go back, and I say start at the beginning. My great-grandmother was named Georgia Woodthorpe. She was born in 1859 in San Francisco. And when she was 6 years old, her parents took her to an acting club with something, and they had great actors in San Francisco. And the head of it was fascinated by her and said, can she come and work with us and do child parts? Well, she went on to be a great figure in the stage in San Francisco and later in a minor way in movies. But she is most noted for being the youngest Ophelia to the great Edwin Booth's Hamlet. And it was Georgie who started 5 generations of Stevenses in show business. And she gave birth to Georgie Cooper, her daughter. Yes, of course, yes, figures. But Georgie became an actress as well, and she married another actor named Landers Stevens, and they became a husband and wife. They played in the theater together. Dickens, the play, the classics and the modern plays, and they had 2 sons, one of which was my father, and he spent his time, because they were not particularly well off, so the boys would come to the theater at night. And when I was making this film, I was going through recordings of my father's interviews, and I was just struck by one where he talked about being in the theater, and he described it that way, that his parents, they needed to have him there. And so he would do his homework under the stage. And my father had a wonderful voice. And he was describing this and how he would wait. His favorite play was when my grandfather played Sidney Carton in A Tale of Two Cities. And he said he would go to the end of the play and sit under the stage, and he would hear his father climb the steps to the guillotine. And he would hear him recite the words, "It is a far, far better place I go to." That wonderful passage. And you could hear the audience, you could feel the audience getting very still. And he said, then you would hear the noise of the guillotine coming down with this crisp. And you would feel the breathlessness in the audience. And then you would hear the curtain unfurl and the board hit the stage. And then you would hear all the hands come together in applause. And you realized that a 10-year-old was hearing that. And I think it has a great deal to do with how sensitive a director he was and how he understood how to create those moments that those of you who were there yesterday saw. And the other side of my family, my mother, Yvonne, her mother was named Alice Howell, her stage name. And Alice Howell was in vaudeville in New York, and her second husband came down with something, tuberculosis, they thought, so they had to go to a warm climate. But he'd been in a quartet at, if you'll forgive me, a restaurant called Nigger Mike's with Irving Berlin and Max Sennett. And he wrote to Max Sennett and said they were coming to Los Angeles. And they come out and they got a little place over on Occidental Boulevard. And she would walk over to Max Sennett and he gave her extra work. And she was, small parts. And she was, and she said when the other girls, when we have to go tumbling down, they were worried about their dresses, but I was totally into it. And Max Sennett recognized that and gave her better parts. And then it's kind of interesting, there was a telegram that exists that to him from this touring group that Cary Grant grew out of, I forget the name just now, English touring actors. And they said, yes, the fellow you want, Chiffin, will arrive on March 3rd. Well, of course, Chiffin was Chaplin. And Chaplin went to Matt Sennett. And Alice Howell starred with Chaplin in his first 5 movies.
Wow.
In the first one, she played Dr. Payne. I mean, she played the wife of Dr. Payne, who was a dentist, and was not spelled P-A-Y-N-E. And in it, Charlie Chaplin pulled down her bloomers. But Alice, and the Matt Sennett didn't work out for Alice, so she became an independent. And she made 100 silent films. And there's a very nice small book called She Could Have Been Chaplin. And because she had all of Chaplin's techniques, even a variation of his little sort of walk. And she had a wonderful career, and she retired very early. And I remember her as the woman with reddish hair who would be taking casseroles over to my father's apartment. But then it was only about 4 or 5 years ago, her films were not preserved. They did favor the gentleman in terms of the Nat Day and the movies, and the Chaplin and Keaton and Harold Lloyd, theirs are all preserved. But gradually, in part because of the American Film Institute, they preserved her films, or some of them, and I went to see them in the theater, in the AFI Theater in Silver Spring. And it was, I'd seen just a few little videos, but with an organ and the full treatment on the huge screen to see my grandmother for the first time, and to feel an audience and see them laughing. And one of them, in one of the films, Oliver Hardy, not yet with Stan Laurel, performed. And my mother, we saw a little glimpse of her yesterday in the movie. Was a splendid person, a great sense of humor. She became an actress, but retired in order to further my life. She was, her mother described Alice Howell. Her father died, and she had to go east. And my mother's stepfather said, Friday night they were going up to pay parties for dinner. And she said, oh no, she tells the story in herself. I was brooding over some lost boyfriend. And I said, I don't want to go. And he said, no, come on, you ought to go. So I went up to Oliver and Hardy's and his wife's house. And they were great friends, Alice and Dave. And then they said, oh, he's late, he's shooting over in Culver City. He's bringing his cameraman home for dinner. And they waited and waited. And she said, I had a little Cupid doll haircut. And she was at her greatest height, 4'11" and a half. And I was sitting in a little chair. And in comes Babe, huge man, and behind him, this 24-year-old. And she said, I thought this must be the son of the cameraman. Well, of course, it was George Stevens. And she said, from last night in the film, well, it turns out I wasn't 14 years old, and he was the cameraman, and you can take it from there. So anyway, we had this sort of wonderful.
Excuse me, George.
I had this blessing of a
You gotta
wonderful.
move your mic closer to you.
Sure. A wonderful family and a really remarkable father. Seen in the film. And, in that world of Hollywood, there were so many unhappy sons of famous fathers. And I sort of dodged that bullet. He went on to, as you saw in the film, to learning from Stan Laurel that comedy could be graceful and human. Alice Adams, which you saw some of last night, is a wonderful example of that. That there's great comedy, but it comes out of believable characters, and it's not zany or antic, and it's therefore very touching. The more the merrier, with Joel McRae and Jean Arthur also, had that quality, the naturalness, which was that wonderful scene that Frank Capra said is the funniest and sexiest scene in the movies.
I think one of the things that was, I think in your film, Alan Pakula, I think, was the director.
Yes.
Who said it takes courage to take your time with comedy, to let it go slowly. And your father had that courage because, as Katherine Hepburn was saying in the film, that she didn't think it was going to be funny with the dinner scene. And your father knew what he was doing, taking time to have all those things happen.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Katherine Hepburn? You probably know this, George, but she had a presence here on Boca Grande. She came frequently to this island, and some of the people still here remember her, and she was, of course, an iconic figure. I loved seeing those pieces of her interview and her things in like Alice Adams, which is a movie I had not seen. Can you tell us more about her?
Yes, well, she was quite a bit like you heard about her. I mean, she a woman of strong opinions, and when I was making this film, Katherine obviously was key to it, but she kept having mishaps, a broken leg, or this and that, and I was kind of getting desperate because we had to finish it, and then we made an appointment, and that interview was filmed in her apartment on 49th Street, whatever it is, on the east side. And I called her the night before. I was in Washington and I was coming up in the show. And she got very upset. She said, "What, you're in Washington. I'm going to be here tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. You're going to have all these electricians here." And I said, "Well, I'm taking the 8 o'clock shuttle. I do it all the time, And I get to the airport, and the Eastern shuttle was canceled. And so I sprinted down to the other end of the airport and got on the American flight. And then I got off and I kind of rushed for a taxi cab and got in New York taxi cab, and I said, "I want to go to 42 East 49th Street." And the driver says, he says, "Miss Katherine Hepburn, thank you." He was a French tour guide. He was also a taxi driver. And she was just great. And she did that interview. She was so prepared. And even there's that moment in it, which I did not devise, but it was so perfect. When she said, she says, "I was on the RKO lot in a car, flirting, I'm afraid to say, with Charles Boyer. and your father's face appeared right here in the window, And it introduced me, the narrator, to the audience, so it cemented the idea that I was telling the story, and she gave me that.
Yeah.
So she,
Yes.
And one of the things that she mentioned was that your father and Spencer Tracy had much in common in their personalities.
Yes.
They were strong, silent type,
yeah,
very few words, but they were watchers.
yeah. And George Cukor, who directed Kate's others of her comedies very well, Dad did this first one, which was about reporters. She is kind of high-toned foreign correspondent, and Tracy, the sports writer on the paper. And of course, Dad was very comfortable in the world of sport, and it was a wonderful casting of a director because he was like Tracy, and we did a showing of his film, The Greatest Story Ever Told, a restoration, and Guillermo del Toro, the brilliant Mexican director and the most astute observer of films of all kind, did the lecture, and he said of George, he said he was a laconic man, and his films had a laconic quality often, in art. So yes, so Kate was important.
During that time of his making lighter comedies, or lighter, not necessarily lighter comedies, but lighter fare, he made that film Swing Time with Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, which I think all of us loved seeing. That dress and that dance were just wonderful. And that, you pointed out that the dance had a role of furthering the plot.
Yeah.
And that was your father's innovation, right?
It was. I mean, it's storytelling. Swing Time, if you haven't seen it, it's often on Turner Classic Movies. The critics say that Swing Time is really the peak of the Astaire Rogers pictures, in part because of what we've been talking about. Believable characters. It's a little less, antic. It's more, and there's some important, really moving moments in the film, and it's just beautiful.
Well, I hope you don't mind if I go to change the theme here, but your father saw Triumph of the Will, which was the film glorifying Hitler. And he said that the film influenced his life more than any film he had ever seen. Did he talk to you later about that?
He did. He was, I mentioned yesterday that he was finishing The More the Merrier, and 1942. And he asked to get a print of Lisa Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. And he watched it alone one night editing in a theater at Columbia Pictures. You described the effect. And he realized that he could not stay home during the war. And he was well over draft age. He arranged to get a commission on the basis that he would serve overseas. And when my mother and I we saw him off in Washington at the new National Airport, flying to North Africa, where he first served, and then he went to London, where General Eisenhower placed him in charge of combat photography for the war in Europe. And he and his men went in on D-Day, and he rode a jeep called Toluca, after Toluca Lake where we lived, all the way through the war, Normandy, liberation of Paris, Battle of the Bulge, link up at the Russians at Torgau and Dachau. And it was, as described earlier, life-changing experiences. Mark Harris, in his wonderful book, Five Came Back, about 5 directors who served overseas. He said that at Dachau, George Stevens ceased being a filmmaker and became a gatherer of evidence, because he was very conscious that this, if not filmed, would not be believed, because it was beyond belief. And he himself went into that boxcar that you saw photographing the dead bodies. And so it was an important experience for him, the war. And I guess that's why he says that Leni Riefenstahl's film changed his life. And it changed my life, because my mother said goodbye to him, and we didn't see him for 3 years. When he came back, I was just graduating within a year from Harvard School in North Hollywood, California. And I did not have my act together very much, although I was going to go to Occidental College, but I didn't have a summer job. So he said, "Well, do you want to help me?" And I said, "Sure." And so he gave me 2 jobs. One was, he worked from an apartment out in North Hollywood. My mother and father divorced and moved out of our house. She had built 7 apartment townhouses during the war, and she and I moved into one of the 7. My father moved into the center one. My grandmother, Alice, moved in. So, anyway. And so we worked from home. And one was to read Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy, and 2 black books, loose leaf books. One, volume 1 and volume 2, listing every incident, all the characters, which I did. The other was to read story. He was about to make A Place in the Sun, based on start the script of Dreiser's American Tragedy. The other was to read books. And I read so many dreary, treacly summer love stories. And I was 17, and that was hard work. One day, a small book came, and I read it in an afternoon. And that afternoon I went to my father's, his bedroom, his apartment, and he was in bed reading. And I said, "Dad," I said, I read this book. I think it's really a good story, and I suggest that you read it. He said, "Why don't you tell me the story?" So there I was, pacing around his bed, doing my best to recollect the story of Shane. Now looking back, I realized that he gave me this opportunity, to let me know, in case I was interested, whether I had any skill or in this sort of work. So anyway, I told him the story of Shane, and the next summer I was in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, with my Western hat. As something called company clerk, working with him on the shooting of Shane, which was just a great life experience, to be under those Tetons. And he knew how to capture the Tetons in a way you saw yesterday. Sometimes you see them in movies and they go kind of flat, but he used long telephoto lenses, moved them way back, and had the characters here, and the mountains got pulled up to their grandeur. And I learned so much. And I like to say that the most important thing I learned was respect for the audience. You know, the studios used to, and that's why they didn't understand Shane. They tried to sell it to Howard Hughes after they saw it. They didn't think it worked. But you know, they wanted you to treat the audience as 14-year-olds. You know, that's the mentality. But Dad, you know, some kind of an interviewer was talking to him about Shane and having seen it and was comparing it to the King Arthur legend. And he said, well, who did you make this picture for? And he said, I think I made it for a truck driver in Kansas. He says he spends his day, long days by himself. You know? And when he has time to see a movie, he's got thoughts of his own. And let him bring some of his ideas to the film. Don't talk down to him. Don't point it all out. You know, and you see that in his film, that respect for the audience, and that's been a great lesson for me too.
And Shane was not a traditional hero at all. He was humble.
Right.
He was not the traditional hero of most westerns. What would you call that, his masterpiece?
Well, the last weekend, 3 weekends ago in Hollywood, both Martin Scorsese and Guillermo del Toro described My Father as the greatest story ever told, as the culmination of his work. And masterpiece was salted in there. And it was not as enthusiastically received in 1965. It came out at a very troubled time. The cover of Time magazine that month was Is God Dead? And it was the midst of the Vietnam War. And it got badly or harshly treated by Judith Crist and some important critics. But to see it 60 years later, this beautiful restoration, and to hear Marty and Guillermo describe it, you know, two of the great auteurs of today. But Shane, A Place in the Sun, and Giant, which we haven't touched on, you know, it's swing time, and the more the merrier. You know, there's just almost all of his films stand the test of time. And in Giant, I had the opportunity of working with him on. I got out of college and I was supposed to go into the Air Force. I was a lieutenant, graduated as a first lieutenant, and the Korean War ended, and I didn't have anything to do. And so he let me work with him on Giant, writing the script with him and the script writers for 9 months. And I came back and he was still editing it. So I worked with him on the editing, and it was a great experience. And you know, being around and seeing him work with actors is different as Rock Hudson, Elizabeth Taylor, and James Dean. Jimmy finished shooting ahead of the others because he dies partway through the picture. And I happened to be at the studio on leave from the Air Force when he was shooting that fight scene in the diner. Rock Hudson gets kind of knocked apart. And we're sitting there and Jimmy Dean walks in and with his shades and sits down next to me and we chat a little bit. And he says, I got a new Porsche. And he said, a Spider. he says, "You want to ride?" And I said, "Sure." I'm 21, 22, same as Jimmy. And we go out, and this little thing, he had the little bastard, it was the name on it, this gray horse spider. And we get in it, it's sitting on the ground, and we drive around with these sound stages and prop trucks, and Jimmy's driving, at a good pace. We circle around and come back and park. And he looks over kind of proudly, said, "What do you think?" And I said, "It's nice, Jimmy, it's nice." Well, of course, 2.5 weeks later, he died in that car. I think Jimmy would have, he was a troubled guy, but I think he would have gone on, and I think he would have been a director, and then he only made 3 movies, and Giant was the last. But you would?
No, go ahead.
I would like to say something about the Diary of Anne Frank. And I guess we're kind of eating up time here.
We're
but,
good.
I had kind of made my way, and my career was going nicely. I was directing episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents and Peter Gunn when I was 26, 27. And my father asked me to work with him on the Diary of Anne Frank. And, this kind of ended up being his war film. He thought of making one of Irwin Shaw's, I forget the title. Irwin was in his unit during the war, as was Bill Saroyan. But he ended up making the Diary, and he and I went to the Cannes Film Festival where he was on the jury. It was 1957, and it was the year of Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal. It was Truffaut's 400 Blows. I mean, it was change in the cinema, and he was on the jury. But then we drove to Munich and stayed at the hotel and got up in the morning and drove to Dachau. And this was his first time back in Europe, and certainly the first time at Dachau. And I took a picture of him, that's in the book, of standing in front of a shower bath, that Brausbad, which means shower bath, and the look on his face in a tan jacket. And David Mamet, who I didn't know, found me and said he wanted that picture, and I had a copy made for him. But we then went together, father and son, to Normandy. And we went to Juno Beach where he landed, and we talked with your father about that experience. And we drove around and went to the graveyard on the hill, so beautiful, with the crosses and the Stars of David. And our mission was to go to Amsterdam because we were preparing the Diary of Anne Frank. And we checked into the Amstel Hotel, and the next morning went downtown into a little office building and rang the doorbell. And the door was opened by a tall, balding man, very straight, standing, named Otto Frank, Anna Frank's father. And Otto had been in the German army in the First War. He was an officer. And he came back to Germany, and soon his daughter was asked to wear a star. And he realized that they had to leave. And he went to Amsterdam and started a spice factory on the Princeton across the street. And we meet him here, and he was with, and his wife and his daughters, Anna, his wife Edith and Anna, and Margot, the daughters, all died at Bergen-Belsen. Otto survived Auschwitz, and with him, when we met, was his wife, his new wife, who we met at Auschwitz. And they had us prepared a little modest office building and a little table, and cupboard, and coffee. And Otto was getting a look at the man who was going to be telling his daughter's story. And very polite and talked and all of that. And conversation was going on, and he went to a filing cabinet, and he opened it, and he took something out, wrapped in cloth, and unwrapped it, placed it before my father and me. And it was Anna's diary, with the pictures all pasted in, her inscriptions, her little jokes. Well, of course, it's very moving. And then he took us, we took a motor Motorskaffe and went to the Prinsengracht, which was now empty, the factory where they hid on the top floor. And we walked in and we climbed the stairs. And my father spoke of it, you saw in the film yesterday, about going and by a window you heard something flutter. And he said you just sensed Otto react, as if there was something spiritual, a sound. And they got up to the top floor, and Dad asked Otto, Mr. Frank, he said, could you tell us about the day when they came for you? And he did, and he's such a proud man, and he's seen such horrors. But he described it, and they said there came a tremendous noise, broke down the bookcase, the false wall, came in, and they grabbed his briefcase, and where he had the jewelry, the ration cards, the passports, the money, everything, and emptied it out on the floor with a bunch of papers, and it was just all cluttered. And they scooped up the money in the top, and left all the papers on the floor, and herded them out. And as my father described it, they left the evidence. The papers were Anna's diary, and that her voice would become so much more powerful than the Führer's. It was at 80 million or whatever, the book, it's still it's seen around the world, and I was so pleased to work with him on it in the studio, and as usual he got behind schedule, and the studio was concerned, and so they asked him, please, you have to stay and finish it and get someone else to shoot the second unit work in Amsterdam, all of the exteriors, and he asked me to do it, and I was concerned. I said, he hadn't let anybody else do that before. And I said, well, I guess if I can get a good cameraman. And we were able to get Jack Cardiff. Jack was a British cameraman from Black Narcissus and so many great films, and also a wonderful spirit, and great art lover. We went to the museums, and his wife. And Jack also had a great sense of humor. He took me to dinner, and the night before we started shooting, he was also a bit of a love food, and with a couple others, and he made a little toast and telling me, that hope the work went well. And he said, Diary of Anne Frank, as you recall, is in black and white. And he said, George, it's just one thing I think I should tell you. I've never shot a frame in black and white. He'd come up through Technicolor. He was a Technicolor consultant and did The Red Shoes and Black Narcissus and so many wonderful films. And anyway, so the Diary of Anne Frank was a great experience.
Well, beautiful story, George, and you've had so many extraordinary experiences, so many great accomplishments, and I'm pleased, all of us are pleased that you are receiving the awards that you deserve. And we want to open the questioning to the people who are out there. I'm going to ask one more question, however, George. Are you working on a project now?
I am. The quiet of the peacefulness of Boca Grande is making it. There are a couple of writer friends here who know writing is no fun. But I am working on an adaptation for a streaming in the spirit of the Crown or Downton Abbey of Doris Kearns Goodwin's No Ordinary Time. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt on the home front, which is a magnificent story. And I think it would be a great thing for the American people and people abroad to see of how Americans at their finest managed government and used government at its best to prosecute the most ambitious war really in human history and really save the world. And I think it will be both tremendously entertaining. The personal story of Franklin and Eleanor is complex, and he ended up being the greatest man of the 20th century, and she ended up being the greatest woman of the 20th century. And they so understood the democratic process. And so I'm working on that, and don't hold your breath.
What a great project. Well, thank you, George. I will open it to questions.
And we have microphone, if you wait for your microphone.
You refer to, on the cover of your memoir, the golden age of Washington.
Yes.
In your view, what exactly was that, and will it ever come back?
Well, that suggests that it's gone. I would, yes. Well, I'll describe my experience, yes. Life-changing experience. When we finished the Diary of Anne Frank, 1960, it was an election of President Kennedy. 1961, in a total coincidence, I met a hero of mine, Edward R. Murrow. He left CBS at the request of President Kennedy to head the United States Information Agency, which was tasked with telling America's story abroad with radio, the Voice of America, movies, publications and all. And Murrow asked me to come at age 29 and run the motion picture division of USIA. I turned him down. I told him that I was now my father's partner, and he was preparing the greatest story ever told, and I really couldn't leave him. And Murrow understood and said, if anything changes, let me know. And the next day I was at the studio with Dad. We were walking to lunch, and I had not discussed this with him. He'd gone to the big dinner for the moguls and all with Murrow. I hadn't. And I told him, and he stopped walking. And he looked at me and he said, I think you may have to do it. And he understood my interest, not his interest. Because the greatest story ever told was a tremendously tough picture, and I would have been a great deal of help. But it changed my life. I met Caroline's mother, And I worked with President Kennedy and Ed Murrow, two great mentors. President Kennedy, I was watching, I would occasionally go to his press conferences, and I was watching one on television, and he had used great quotes, and he said, he spoke of the Greek definition of happiness. And I took out my pencil, and he said, the Greek definition of happiness is the fullest use of one's powers along lines of excellence. And I realized that working for Murrow and making all these films under President Kennedy, I was living the Greek definition of happiness. And much of my life has been that, and I pass it on because I think it's such a truth if we can achieve that. And just to stay with your question, and Lyndon Johnson, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, President Reagan, H.W. Bush. I've known of all the presidents since except for one. And there were great experiences with all of them. They all participated in the Kennedy Center Honors. They did another show called Christmas in Washington that I did. And I really had affection for them and was proud to know them and learned from most of them. And it just added to this kind of extraordinary life. I'll tell one story. I went to Washington had no idea what kind of a job this was going to be. And working with Murrow, when Murrow took the job, there had been a guy named Louis Schmidt who had been purged from USIA by Joseph McCarthy, Senator McCarthy. Brutal. And when Murrow took the job, he met with the Foreign Service officers at the first meeting and introduced Reed Harris, who he said he had hired as his personal assistant, which was just a sign of Murrow's character and insight, because there were tears in the eyes of all these people who lived through McCarthy, and to see Murrow. And then at a dinner, I became an extra man, so I got invited to stuff. A black tie dinner at the Shrivers, and Sergeant and Eunice Shriver, Eunice, the sister of the president, and I drove my little rental car out there in the snow. The California boy doesn't drive too good in the snow. They got there, come in, and there's an orchestra and all the tables, and Hubert Humphrey and McGeorge Bundy and Newton Minow sat just across from me, the 37-year-old head of the FCC, who declared the vast wasteland of television, which is such a great, and I talked with Minow during dinner, and then afterwards they passed drinks, and I got my scotch, and I was standing there kind of in this circular hallway, and the band's in the next room, and I'm just living the dream. and the door, there are a lot of people in this circular place, and I have an eye on the door. In through the door walks John Fitzgerald Kennedy with no coat, black tie. He and Johnson had a dinner for the Saudi whomever, a stag dinner, and they come after, and I'm there 3 weeks, and President Kennedy walked around this room, circular room, and I was sort of in the second row, so I didn't get to say hello to him, but he was not far away, And it was black and white television for the most part then, and to see him in color was just breathtaking. and just all, and you know, and he walked and went on into the party, and I said, well, no, it's done. You know, and then I'm talking a little later with my Scotch and with Newton Minow, and I'm talking. As you see, I'm capable of talking. And Newton's kind of listening. And I see Newton's. I kind of worried that he stopped listening, and he said, "Have you met the president?" No. Yeah. And then I look across, and here's President Kennedy, and he's introducing me, and you know, and he starts to say, and George has come here, Edward R. Murrow, he's working with Edward R. Murrow, and Kennedy says, well, I know all about George. He said, Newt, what I'm concerned with is that CBS is broadcasting Jackie's tour of the White House in black and white. Why aren't they broadcasting it? Which is just so typical of what you heard about President Kennedy, that what was ever in front of him, his mind was always working, you know? and then he turned to me. Well, actually, the way that worked was, he said, well, George, there's something I want to talk to you about, but Newt, Jackie, you know, he did that. And then the conversation kind of continued, and he drifted off and said, I'll be in touch. So suddenly Pierre said, I get an invitation from Pierre Salinger to go to the White House. Pierre said, President Kennedy's interested. They're doing the film about PT 109, and he has cast approval, and wants your ideas and all. And I said, Pierre, I said, what you really want if you're making a film about a living president is director approval. And he said, well, what does that mean? And I said, well, he told me that Raoul Walsh, a great director, but I had just seen his most recent film with my father, at 20th Century Fox, called Marines Let's Go, which was so awful. It was a story about Aldo Ray and a bunch of GIs. There's one little scene of them sliding a Japanese bartender up and down the bar, which, you know, it was just bad GIs, no respect for the Japanese. And I said, I think you ought to. And so Pierre said, well, okay, I get another call. We come to the White House. President Kennedy wants to screen Marines Let's Go at 3 o'clock. We want you there. So I went over to Pierre's office, and I'm thinking, oh shit, Jack Warner, who I'd been working with on Giant with my father, is not pleased that he's having to send, that they're now reviewing the choice of director. And so I go to Pierre's office, and this and that, and Khrushchev, and he just said, okay, so we walked to the theater, and Pierre was, I don't know if you remember him at all, but, you know, very outgoing, very smart, pudgy guy. And we were going to walk to the east, what used to be the East Wing, to see the film. And he said, well, it's Khrushchev, the thing with the and so President Kennedy's having to deal with the Khrushchev piece, so he's not going to see the film, but you and I can look at it. And as we're walking, getting close, Pierre says, this is going to be good. I haven't seen a movie in 6 months. So we go in the screening room, you walk in, and the projection is back there, and all the seats facing this way, as you used to walk in. But in the front row, there were 2 easy chairs, a rocking chair in the middle, and 2 easy chairs over here. So Pierre and I go in and sit in the 2 easy chairs, and we start the movie. And I'm watching it, and it's just as bad as I remember it. But Pierre is over there chuckling. Pierre's having a great time. And I'm sitting there saying, how did I get here? I'm sitting in the White House. I've got a great career going. And Jack Warner on one side, and Pierre and President Kennedy saying, the door opened, a butler kind of stands, and you can't see the dark. And somebody walks in and comes in and sits down in the rocking chair next to me. So that could only be one person, right? And he kind of looks over and nods and all, and starts watching the movie. And I swear the movie got better. It was kind of a not too long, and then a couple more scenes, and all of a sudden, President Kennedy leans across Pierre. He says, "Stop the picture." And so Pierre gets up and kind of waves his arm to the projectionist, and the movie goes off, and Pierre comes down and sits in the chair, and President Kennedy leans across me, and he says to Pierre, he says, "Tell Jack Warner to go fuck himself." I love President Kennedy. It's just so smart, and so courageous, a real war career, and subtlety and so many good human qualities. Some, not so abnormal, but none of us are perfect. But it turned out they tried to get John Huston and Fred Zinnemann, two people you saw last night, that neither could do it, so they got another director, and the film turned out all right.
George, I'm afraid this question won't lead to such a good story. But I was curious to have you comment on, to what extent do the constraints the studio put on a filmmaker in terms of sticking to budget or sticking to a running time, to what extent do those constraints help or hinder the arc?
Any film that's going to be beyond expectations, they're hindering it. Obviously some control is necessary. Most of my father's films went over budget. And as I said, Paramount tried to sell Shane Howard years after they'd seen it. And it became the most successful picture for Paramount up to that date. My father, his career was all about control of his work. And he maintained that.
Self-control.
Control of the budget, of the cutting. He had final cut in his contract. Katherine Hepburn spoke yesterday about RKO wanting the happy ending for Alice Adams. After that, he got final cut and exercised it to great effect. It's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, I was so privileged to watch this love story, this love note to your father yesterday. And this program now complements it perfectly, because I had a sense that you stepped back and removed yourself from the story of the movie as son, as filmmaker, and let it really be about your father. Except there were a couple of tells about this great love. That reference to the 3 years without him. And then when your father opened a package from your family on the Toluca Jeep, and your note that said, your note said to Dad, and it fell out. And I thought, how did you constrain your heart to make this really about your father, as opposed to mixing all of the emotions, obviously? How did you step back and let it be about his work more than just son to father?
Well, respect for the audience. storytelling that I learned from him. Sometimes I kind of felt he was over my shoulder during the editing, getting it down to time. But what I felt yesterday, your response was just so wonderful. This is a film was made 40 years ago, although it's now in this high definition, looking so wonderful. But I really felt that you were somehow taken, I hope, with the sort of ethics of it and his sense of the human condition, and that it's a film, and the films within it are films that can make you feel better about the world, and the values in those films are ones that we like to respect as humans and Americans. So I say that. I don't know if that's an answer, but it's a bunch of words.
Maybe we'll just have one more question.
George, this has been fantastic. Everyone agrees, I'm sure. But in the late 1960s, I was living in a kind of a tumble-down ranch in Montana. And unexpectedly, I had a visit. I have to back up a little bit. The ranch only lacked, I thought, one thing, which was a porch. So I undertook to build the porch myself. I subsequently had a visit from Jack Schaefer, the author of Shame, who knew a friend of mine, Montana, Meredith knows what it was. And Jack Schaefer came, and I kind of was looking up to him because he did written this marvelous book. And I thought, I'll give him a tour, but most especially, I'll give him a tour of the porch that I just built. And Jack followed me around this awful place, and then we get out on the porch. I was so proud of it. And Jack was a very practical guy. He looked after himself in many ways. And he walked around, looked at my porch, and he said, "Tom, you're a nice fellow, but this thing's going to fall down and kill people."
Oh my God! Well, that's it. I mean, that's a. It is Tom McGuane has experience around films. He escaped, and of course, one of our great authors. But so many things go into making a film. I mean, there it is, a story, and the Jack Schaefer story is really solid, and my father added his dimension to it. He'd come back, it allowed him to express a theme. He'd come back from the war, seen men at their best and their worst, but he'd also seen what a .45 could do to a human being. And that scene where Jack Palance shoots Elisha Cook, it was not somebody getting shot and tumbling over and shooting back. It was in a muddy street. We arrived to shoot the scene on Saturday, and the street was not muddy enough for my father. So he sent everybody home at considerable cost to Paramount Pictures, a decision they would not have approved of, and flooded the street. So it had that, where the little guy could barely move walking down the street, keep his balance. And he put a harness around him and wires and 3 big stagehands. So when Palance shoots him, these guys pull him back into the mud, the hands splat. And Sam Peckinpah is quoted in the book. He said that's when Westerns changed. He said, George Stevens said, for us, a shooting is a Holocaust. Thank you for the Jack Schaefer story, which just reminds us that many, many people contribute to great films, and you are a fabulous audience.
You, George, are a fabulous speaker, writer, producer, director. I loved reading your book, loved seeing the film yesterday, and listening to you today. And if we go back to what John Kennedy said, that you quoted, where happiness is the full use of your powers along lines of excellence, you're a happy man.